was scheduled to give one of the lectures in what was an old citizenship course. It was a big course for underclassmen, and it was in the chapel. And I get up there to give my lecture, and I look down, and there are two people having intercourse, like in the third row.
You got a lot of young people with the resources and the time in which to mount these kinds of things, and they were all together. I mean, that was the critical mass.
Pretty much everybody was active in the student protests. If you were on campus, you could not avoid being active.
After 1968, the students are letting themselves be heard on a number of issues.
That was, 70 was the centennial year of the university, which of course most of those ceremonies got lost within the strike. But until that time, I think there had been 8 chancellors of the university. My year, 71, we went through 3.
Richard Nixon was hung in effigy on a platform right in front of the Newhouse school. No cops came.
Universities provided communities for this kind of thing to become easily organized.
It's too easy, I think, to tell history in terms of headlines. And if you talk about what happened to Syracuse in 1970 in terms of the headlines, we would all miss a tremendous amount of important information.
Just an absolute hotbed of protest. It was just amazing.
If you weren't part of it, I don't see how you could have any fun.
The greatest of all the student strikes during that strike spring of 1970, which was the moment in which there was more student upheaval on American campuses than ever before or since, certainly since, in American history, happened on this campus.
The revolution is the internal twist where you yourself realize that you've got power and you can try to make things happen. It means that you also have to be understanding that what you want to happen may not be the way things go, but that you're going to try anyway. That's the revolution.
I was not at Syracuse in 1970, nor were my children, of course. And I think that in a way that's the point of this entire exercise, which is to help put those of us who weren't there, actually there.
There was so much crazy stuff going on in the United States at that time, and you were a part of it, well, again, whether you wanted to be or not.
Martin Luther King had been assassinated, Bobby Kennedy had been assassinated.
Black Power.
Civil rights movement.
The feminist movement.
Riots during the Democratic Convention in Chicago. There were many social movements going on at the same time. These things were all layered on top of each other.
If you were on campus, you could not avoid being active.
You know, pick your movement.
The temperature was rising constantly.
The thing is that there's so many things going down and something has to come up, like fraternities are going down and independents are coming up.
You know, we should just be free in everything we do and sort of, not really isolated, but autonomous.
This is something everybody wants.
We were very innocent. I mean, you know, those of us who went to college when I did, we grew up in the 50s. We grew up in a tremendous time of innocence and in a very cocoon-like environment, particularly the majority of us at Syracuse.
We are the people of this generation, raised in at least modest comfort.
The whole generation had been raised being told we were the brightest and the best and we could do anything we want, so it was time to do that.
With a world in which students were looking to change the events that had seemed to be the sleepy, happy, contented America of the 1950s.
It was a very, very tumultuous and violent time.
There was like a sign of the times that you got involved in something.
I would say the most important issue that concerns most of the students is the Vietnam War.
It's Vietnam. It's definitely the war in Vietnam.
If you If you think about layering on top of these very personal murders that we all watched, a war in Vietnam where hundreds, thousands of people were being killed, hundreds of Americans. It was on television every night.
I think that the brutality was just a shocker to us. We didn't think that sort of thing could be perpetrated by Americans.
This war was a disastrous decision, and it created an abyss which was changing American society.
A lot of the soldiers that were coming back in caskets were young people like ourselves, and that was just awful. It was right there in our faces every day, and it was very scary.
All these things were happening. You just shook your head and go, oh my God, what's going to happen next?
And by 1964 or 5, as America became involved on the ground in the war in Vietnam, the anti-war movement emerged and soon subsumed everything else.
Young people, particularly young people on college campuses, we understood what the underlying reasons were for much of the violence that we were watching. And in many cases, these explanations for what was going on pointed to our own government.
They believed if they had the levers of power, then America could be moved in the right direction.
And if ever you're going to have a place where people care enough about an argument that they start popping each other over the heads with picket signs, a campus would be that place. I mean, this is real estate that's supposed to be heavily invested in the passionate pursuit of ideas.
As the nation changed over the 1960s, Vietnam became more important as an issue, became more unpopular. The same trends were reflected among Syracuse students.
It was a multifaceted student movement that was growing across the years, but no one anticipated that this campus would be hit the way it was.
I think we felt this tremendous responsibility as Americans.
It was just, to me, a punctuation point for my college career.
It was the nature of the draft that really mobilized the energies of protest here.
I had obviously that sword of Damocles hanging over my head.
It was a random thing. You had a high draft number or a low draft number.
A good percentage of the males protesting against the war were protesting because they didn't want to be drafted.
The idea that we could be called up.
The guy down the hall, I mean, he might be there one week, and the next week he'd be drafted. You know, he'd be gone.
Come graduation day, we were fair game.
The fear then was really strong. You don't know it unless you were around then.
I was terrified. I had no idea what would happen to me if I got drafted. I thought that I was probably the least prepared human being ever to enter military service. I had zero desire to go to Vietnam or anywhere.
Ironically, anyone who was a college student while you were a college student was exempt from the draft.
One of the more prominent protesters against the war, he showed up at the draft office for his physical, naked as I recall. There were also occasions in which students burned their draft cards during a demonstration up here.
One of the protests that I participated in was a march on the draft board office, the recruiting center in Syracuse, in downtown Syracuse.
We had the freedom to speak, the freedom to be angry at things, and the freedom to organize.
But these things were so far out of our hands. I mean, we didn't have the vote when we were in Syracuse. Who were we going to protest to? The mayor? The governor of the state? No, the authorities that were closest to us, which would have been the administration of the university.
And you can't describe a student, you know, like every student is different religion-wise, you know, whether even a typical fraternity brother is not anymore what a typical fraternity brother used to be.
You can look for any type of personality up here. There's closed minds up here, there's open minds, it's everything. It's like a little world in itself.
There's too much emphasis on things other than academic affairs. There's too much emphasis on the problems of Vietnam, of war, and these should be cast aside and academic problems should come first.
Newspapers and people would say on our campus and other campuses, they're all radicals. Well, they're not all radical. Kids were wearing tattered jeans and long hair, and they were hanging out in front of the chapel on those plebiscitory afternoons, but that doesn't mean they're all radicals.
There was more than one viewpoint on the campus.
You know, there were always those straight folks that didn't partake of this stuff.
The one view was the expressed view, because most students who I think believed as I did or were kind of in the middle weren't activists. You know, they didn't protest, they just kind of went about their business.
I was pretty much amused, and more amused than I think disgusted. You know, as I look for toleration from the other side, I tried to be tolerant of the other side.
There was a certain amount of harassment of students who were not participating in the protest, and in particular, students who were members of the ROTC were targeted by the radicals, and they were prevented from attending class. Sometimes they were prevented from crossing campus with their uniforms on.
I think I was amongst the majority of the students who were very much aware of certain groups within the university who, you know, were taking very strongly their views regarding the war and ultimately the Kent State murders and so forth. But I was amongst the majority who knew it was there. We sympathized with them, but we were not actively involved.
I recognized that some kids, and we were kids, these were not men and women, these were kids. I realized that some kids, you know, they were experiencing freedom for the first time. They were rebelling against parental authority for the first time.
But at the far end of campus, there were some, if I can use the expression, frat boys playing Frisbee. And I thought, it's not everybody. And every time people try to generalize about my generation and protests and everything, I think of the people playing Frisbee at the end of the mall at that moment saying, they had to be doing that deliberately. They couldn't have been that clueless about what was going on. So that's really stands out, that it wasn't this universal movement.
I don't think the university student body was apolitical totally. I think we shared a lot of their thoughts.
There were good issues underlying it. You know, I think history has shown that the Vietnam War was a mistake. So, you know, in the end, I don't think one side was clearly wrong or right. My main objection was to the methods, you know, employed.
Much of what we were doing as anti-war protesters seemed to us to be so much more important and so much more real than anything we were learning about in class. And it was. I mean, it was life or death that we were dealing with.
What makes Syracuse unique?
Unique? I didn't know it was.
Probably the university is one of the most important places that this kind of a movement or this kind of an attitude can develop.
I think the protests showed to the administration that the students are concerned. I don't think this change has been quick enough.
The whole student body was energized and politicized, and that was not unusual. That was the norm.
There was a big sign on the student government building, which was a frame house, right down where the new administration building is, Krauss-Heinz Hall. And the sign had a clenched red fist and 2 stories high, and it said, "By any means necessary."
The kinds of things that students did to be active in the anti-war movement included becoming more educated about U.S. role in the world political, social scene. Lots of what were called teach-ins.
There was a time when we were getting a big petition together and people, and it was a big thing against the war. We wanted to take to the university, and people were signing it.
I had started getting involved with the anti-war movement as a freshman. I came in 1967. I remember picketing the Career Center against recruiting by Dow Chemical.
it sounded like they were anti-American, you know. They hated what the American government did. There was a war government. There was a big scrawled sign on the back of Maxwell Auditorium, right behind the Oath of the Athenian City-State, if you go down there. AMERIKKKA, the racist imperialist America.
There were rallies, which were meant mostly, I think, to let off steam and also to reach other students. Would draw hundreds of students, and then we'd have another one a month later, and there would be hundreds and hundreds, and then a month later there'd be 1,000 students, and so on.
Well, we did shut down the induction center for half a day at Syracuse University. We had a very large demonstration, and that was a demonstration that incorporated students from other schools as well as our own.
There was one main protest that took place in '68 or '69, where we did a vigil along Salina Street.
Marches? I guess I must have been on some marches. Like a lot of people, I can really prove that I was there by not being able to remember much of it, you know.
Had a lot of fun. We used to sing and chant and sometimes pass joints along, but you know, because we wanted people to have a positive feeling to be there. We didn't want people to just go and feel and be in fear of being attacked by the police.
The quad became a teepee village and tent village.
There were 1,500, between 1,000 and 1,500 students meeting daily on the quadrangle.
There were candlelight marches. There were vigils of various kinds. Prayer vigils, believe it or not.
I drove with a group of students down to Washington, D.C. and participated in this amazing mobilization. There had to be 500,000, maybe more.
The national demonstrations were, they were huge.
Went down to Washington, D.C. for a very large anti-war protest called the Moratorium.
There were people from all different demographics in Washington, D.C. There were young people, there were old people, there were kids, there were all kinds of things going on. And we marched. We marched to the mall, we marched to the Washington Monument, and there was a big contingent from Syracuse.
One of the purposes of it was to have a march past the White House and past the Capitol, where each person was carrying a candle and the name of a soldier killed in the Vietnam War. And these names were on sort of cardboard pieces about this long. People were walking past the Capitol. In front of the Capitol there were coffins, and in the coffins a name would be deposited. It had its good points and bad points. One of the bad points included me getting tear gassed at, I believe it's called DuPont Circle in Washington, D.C. It's the area where I believe all the embassies are.
So it looked to outsiders, to people who didn't understand this, like this was some kind of crazed, radical, Bolshevik upheaval. Of course, it was nothing like that. But the rhetoric was radical, oftentimes. It was a liberation moment in American life. It was youth as a separate stage of life, and it was enormously invigorating for everyone.
As long as the local police didn't suddenly show up on campus, as long as it was being done by the university security group or our own students, we were fine. But we kind of agreed that if all of a sudden we found Syracuse police on campus, we would have all politely packed up our tents and gone home.
They were expecting some violence to be erupting here on campus, but fortunately we had a police chief who was a very, very sensible man.
He was kind of a gruff, old-time Italian cop, and he knew that when you had students or civil rights protesters, you don't raise your billy clubs, keep you cool, joke around a little.
At some point during the year, 1969, 1970, the campus leader, the president of the student government, David Ifshin, reached a gentleman's agreement with the Chief of Police, Thomas Sardino. And they agreed that each would restrain their constituents, meaning Chief of Police would prevent the cops from getting out of hand, and David Ifshin would prevent students from getting out of hand to the extent that he could.
While a member of the Syracuse Police Department, my father also was going to school, graduated, had an undergraduate degree and an advanced degree from Syracuse University. I loved Syracuse University. It was his kind of home away from home, and being a hometown person, you know, won a lot of pride, but also a lot of care, and dealing with any, you know, major type issues that, you know, would bring attention to, you know, this area.
He walked around the campus. Kids would come up to him and scream, "Fuck the pigs, pigs back to the pig pen," and he'd just smile at them and he'd talk to them.
Chief Sardino really went out of his way to, if not bond exactly with students, at least to make it known to them that he wasn't a head cracker.
He was not a dumb man. He didn't want, I don't think any police chief in America wanted Kent State on their hands.
My father was always a defender of the Constitution, which, you know, basically gave these people, gave the students the right to protest peacefully and be heard.
President Nixon is the kindest, most generous man who's ever led this. No, President Nixon was a very dangerous criminal who sat in our White House.
He invaded Laos and he invaded Cambodia.
Everybody thought that he was drawing the war to a close. Vietnam was unpopular, and here's Nixon. The people weren't trusting at that point. Sure enough, here we are. He called it an incursion. The students, anti-war critics, called it an invasion.
Every campus in the United States that had been active in any way at all in the anti-war movement just exploded. And one of the places where it was very spontaneous and very big was Kent State in Ohio. The governor of Ohio saw fit to call out the National Guard. It's an historical fact that the students were protesting. They were asked to leave. Some of them refused to, others did. And at some point the National Guard felt threatened and they opened fire. And 4 Kent State students were killed and others were wounded.
You've actually got corpses. I mean, there were actually casualties in the counterculture war going on.
Assembling on the quad, and there was a bunch of speakers, and then at a certain point in time, the news of what happened at Kent State was made public.
Until Jackson State and Kent State happened, the campus was really fairly calm.
It had a palpable effect. It had an electrical effect going through the crowd. Everybody, I was very much affected. 4 students were killed by the National Guard. Oh my God, we're gonna have to do something about this. This is incredible.
Well, we were terrified when we heard about Kent State, particularly. You know, the idea is that soldiers would shoot at students. It was just horrendous. It was scary. We were all like, dismayed is not strong enough a word.
And it just hit too close to home.
I just remember thinking, how are we going to get out of this? What's going to happen next?
That really shook up everybody and brought us all into the fold of that. We should be allowed to protest. We should be allowed to state what we think without having excessive force used to curtail it.
It was also an invasion of our space, and it triggered something. It triggered an activism on the campus that I think was there, but for a lot of people it was under the surface.
All hell broke loose. At that point, I don't think there was any way to control the emotions and the passions of the students at Syracuse. There were gatherings of students that could have turned into something ugly. There were big bonfires. There were smaller bonfires, big bonfires.
That really prompted everybody, because I think, number one, it kind of put a lot of fear into the student body, which, you know, I kind of thought they were protected. And now all of a sudden they were reading about deaths on campus as a result of nothing more than peaceful protests.
I remember going to the kind of memorial service rally that they had on the quad in front of Hendricks Chapel.
The quad just filled up with thousands of students. David Ifshin was incredibly charismatic.
And being very moved by the speakers and the general sense of solidarity, which was unusual at Syracuse. It's a very fragmented campus. There are a lot of subgroups.
The university responded, I think, correctly in acknowledging that we were all very upset by what occurred at Kent State.
It is really true that we did not trust anybody over 30. We did not trust anybody in authority.
Barricades suddenly appeared, blocking entrances to the campus. The idea of striking, meaning going on strike, circulated.
And after that, for the next week, it was a routine. Classes were history, and every morning we would come to the quad and assemble on the quad. There would be 1,500 or 2,000 people, something crazy.
I had just quit my part-time job to start to study for my finals, and all of a sudden I had no finals to study for.
The barricades went up, the administration building was seized, the student government offices were barricaded, and what I would call the ordinary student. The barricades were literally manned not just by the long-haired, hippie, peacenik types, but the ordinary college student.
You know, they were serious about shutting the university down, and they were not letting anyone on campus who represented the authorities.
That we would shut the campus down, that this campus would not operate as a university anymore.
And I think that motivated the group that ultimately took over the administration building.
The group of students took over the administration building as an effort, as part of the effort to shut the university down.
And Syracuse University was shut down.
And that was the first Syracuse protest in opposition to the Cambodian incursion. There was a national strike called for the next day, but Syracuse was already changing drastically at this point.
So Syracuse was a real leadership school nationally, and we, you know, were one of the first schools that started to try to close down classes.
It was reacting to Nixon's speech, came out of the blue, and students went back that weekend and started organizing.
The strike coursed all across the United States and hit Syracuse University, which was really remarkable because everyone thought that Syracuse is a relatively sleepy place.
It literally ended the semester early.
We thought the whole world had closed down. That's how much we were into it.
Classes did not finish. Final exams were canceled. It really had a significant impact on us.
All the students felt very empowered by that.
That there was this real frenzy on campus, and people were like lighting bonfires and in garbage pails and had barricades up, and everyone was taking this very, very seriously.
I was not in favor of the strike per se, but I was very taken by the passion that students showed during that moment in history.
We closed it down. We barricaded the driveway so you could not drive up in there. A couple of buildings mysteriously caught fire.
The university's newspaper, the Daily Orange, changed its title to Strike. Instead of having the DO, Daily Orange, it said strike, 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 strike.
When word came out on campus on a given day that there was a class in X room, so a bunch of students would go over to try to close it down. I mean, there was really this sense of hysteria.
We had a village, and there was a lot of sex and drugs and rock and roll, and we were all just so excited and frenetic that a lot of things happened that, I don't know, maybe wouldn't happen normally, but they happened because we were together and we felt very close.
There was a kind of strike central that sent out memeos that gave some idea of what was going on.
Every day we had mass meetings on the quad in the morning.
We had something that we were protesting against, And I think it was a way of acknowledging to the student body that we had that right. It was a way of responding, I think, appropriately, which avoided any type of excessive response, both by the university or by the student body.
It was all the themes of the strike, which was not only get us out of Vietnam, but end the racist society, the sexist society, the society that paid no attention to gays and to Hispanics and to people who've been marginalized and victimized.
If it meant canceling the last 6 weeks of school, so be it. It was the appropriate thing to do.
What was interesting was how intimidated many of the faculty members were by all this passion. Some of them went home, didn't want to have anything to do with it. Some were opposed, in favor of the war, and opposed, who were afraid to say anything.
And back then, classes went all the way through the end of May, and you would graduate in early June. So there was still a decent amount of, 2 or 3 weeks of big-time classes left.
When they called the strike, there was a mass meeting of the faculty. All the faculty came to, it was Gifford Auditorium, actually. The faculty were all there, but students lined the whole area. Now, the issue there was what grades would be given.
We want to know what's going to happen to our grades for that year.
We had the choice as students whether to go to class, whether to take a pass-fail, whether to take your grade as is.
A lot of the students saw that as a victory because they thought that it would give them more time to focus on what they thought was the most relevant, which was stopping the war, shutting down the university, discussing issues that really matters.
We basically put the word out that whatever was going to work the best for the students was fine. If you had a grade and you wanted to change to pass-fail, or if you had a pass-fail and you wanted to change it to a grade, in fact, even if you wanted to take a final, they would have made the arrangements for it.
So you have a generation of students at Syracuse and across the nation that have a lot of pass-fail, maybe some incomplete still, their grade before they even took the final exam because of the national strike of May 1970.
As my radicalization started, as I became more and more politically aware and being exposed to student leaders and faculty and events that were held to educate us, this guy, David Ifshin, suddenly got on my radar, student body president.
There was a lot of anti-war stuff going on, and student government that David Ifshin headed up at the time. And he was our first really radical student government leader that we chose, and he really turned things around. Before that, we had guys in sport coats, and here comes David with this, goatee and, a lot of hair and radical ideas, but he was very charismatic, and so it drew a lot of us to the activities that were going on in student government land, especially in terms of war protests.
And David Ifshin, as a student body president, was obviously popular enough to get elected, but he represented this more activist, anti-war student movement mentality.
He amazed me because he just didn't seem like a student.
Among all the student leaders who came and went, he was head and shoulders above the rest.
His thinking was so original. What kept him so interesting in a way to me was that I could never really anticipate what he would say about something. It was always well thought out and it was always well informed, but in some way it was always interesting and surprised me, and definitely wasn't what one would be reading in the newspaper or hear people talking about in sound bites on television. It was always his own take and his own beliefs.
Syracuse was certainly no Columbia University, but we did have our element, Mr. Ifshin, of course, leading that group.
A lot of the self-confidence that we had at the time was because of people like David, where you could sit there and say, he's our age, he's doing this, we can do it too.
He was very favored by the students. They all thought what he was doing was right.
I dug what he was doing, what he was into.
Well, one of the things about Dave, the best way to have gotten to know him was at those meetings that took place at 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, to see how tirelessly he worked in organizing and encouraging people.
He was so charismatic that he made you believe in what he was about. And he was very much into the anti-war movement, other causes, and you didn't mind following him because this guy, he had it going on up here.
He was really such a great model of speaking truth to power.
If we had to view him as a radical, yeah, he was excessive compared to most of the student body at the university. I think we all shared a lot of what he stood for, but we were a bunch of teenagers at school, trying to get an education and still have a good time.
He just seemed to be everywhere, all the time, organizing things, setting things straight.
He was in the thick of it. Every day he was on the podium speaking that I can remember, just whipping up a frenzy, whipping up a storm.
Dave was very good at stuff like that. He could draw a crowd.
You could see the intensity in his face.
We would read about what he was doing in the Daily Orange and kind of think, whoa, he said, he said that. The guy's got nerve.
And he had people around him that just idolized him, just totally idolized him. And just because he had that vision, like I said, he had a vision. He knew what he was doing, where he was going.
And he was very articulate. And he addressed the students many times.
I heard him speak several times. He was a wonderful speaker. He was obviously very dedicated to what he thought was an appropriate cause.
And he had this gift for sort of galvanizing all of the ideas and all the thoughts and putting it out there in a way that everybody could understand it.
But I can still see him in my mind's eye speaking before the university senate and addressing student gatherings and so on.
But his objective was for activists to get the upper hand on people who didn't think the same way we did.
I developed my voice, and I think that Dave helped other people develop their voices because he knew that just his voice alone wasn't going to make that much of a difference.
I think he gave heart and encouragement to lots of students on campus just because he was such a strong leader.
He was sincere. There was something about him that made you feel that he was really sincere.
Dave was going to be graduating, or he wasn't going to be student government president come the fall, and I think that he really wanted to make positive changes for the university while he was still on campus.
I would thank him for putting himself out there and for being such a committed person and making the kind of contribution that he made to the anti-war movement.
David was a wonderful person, and I enjoyed being his friend, and I think that we've had a big loss, and I'm glad to have known him.
I will say this, that the Syracuse University campus was a better place for having Dave Ifshin there.